Howdy, folks. Today we're diving into the world of branding photography. How do you build a standout brand image in 2025? And what does it really take to turn visual storytelling into a thriving business? We'll be talking branding, creativity, and how to level up your photography career with insights from one of the best in the game right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. We spent literally hundreds of hours interviewing some of the most renowned photographers and creatives of our time, giving you access to knowledge and expertise that's not available anywhere else. As always, I'm your host, Kirsten Nutz. And if you're like me and you enjoy free podcasts and YouTube content, you can become a supporter of the show by buying us a coffee over on buymeacoffee.com/camerashake to help us create more exciting episodes for you. But of course, you're more than welcome to say no, no hard feelings. Just know that your support really does make a difference. Now, without further ado, let's give it up for today's special guest, branding photographer, educator, and co host of the Shoot to the Top podcast. Joining us all the way from Bristol is the one and only Marcus Ahmad. Marcus, man, how's it going?
It's going well, Kirsten, and thank you so much for letting me be on the show. I'm so looking forward to this.
Well, thank you for agreeing to come on the show. It's branding photography is actually something that I'm really excited about, mainly because I do, some of it. But I know that a lot of photographers out there are really looking at, getting into branding photography. So give us sort of a helicopter view of what branding photography is and what your approach to branding photography is generally.
Well, let's try and answer that in just one statement. My background is in fashion photography, and I'm a senior lecturer in advertising photography. So I look at branding photography being a combination of both, which is fashion, making people look good, and advertising, selling that product or that service. And it's a combination of those two things for me that I think that's how I perceive branding photography.
So, as a photographer, what are the sort of basic rules? I say rules in inverted commas, obviously, of branding photography. What are the things
Yeah.
that you need to be good at if you're thinking about, getting into branding photography?
Well, you mentioned at the head of the show there about the visual narrative, the storytelling element of photography, which is, in my opinion, inert. There's one thing that photography is brilliant at is telling stories. You can look at an image, a photograph, and within a second, you've built up a story from that photograph. Whether that's the right story or the wrong story is open to debate, and that's a whole many books have been written about that. But yeah, that's what photography is really good. It's great at getting across a message really quickly. So a rule, if you want a rule for a branding photograph, in my opinion, a branding photograph is something that you can look at and it will tell you everything you need to know about that person, what they do, what values they are, what kind of customers they're looking for, all those type of things packaged in one nice image. So that's the aim. Sometimes that can't be done. It takes maybe 2 or 3 images to achieve that effect. But certainly when I do a shoot, that's what I'm aiming for. The whole story in one image.
I think the question often is, who needs branding photography? Like, does everybody, every business, regardless of what industry they're in, need branding photography, or who's the target audience for that in general?
Branding photography, the term, is quite recent. I mean, I think we had a guest on our show recently, and she had been doing branding photography for about 12 or 13 years. And I said to her, wow, you must have been there right at the beginning of branding photography, even before it was called branding photography. And she agreed. She was. In those days, I think it was called more lifestyle photography, or if we were doing a commercial shoot, we called it like a corporate brochure. So it's about that's where the history of it comes in. So it's a recent term. Um, so yeah, that's what for that's that's the history of branding photography. Um, and yeah, so hopefully that sort of tells you something you need, where it's coming from. Yeah.
My impression of branding photography is always that it's sort of a combination of a number of different photographic techniques that say, portraiture, for example, maybe product photography. Um,
Yeah.
what are the different elements that come into that?
Yeah. Well, look, I think it can encompass all of that, and it's y I primarily it's dealing with people. I do generally, deal with people, and I advertise myself as doing a person photographer. But yesterday, for example, I took an advertising job on to photograph a router, and they wanted to raise the brand of this router, like a wireless router, and they wanted it in the living room, and they wanted it with a certain type of people. So it's very advertising led. So it is across the board. I tend to, as I say, photograph people, and I have a niche in that I tend to photograph motivational speakers and coaches.
When you when you're photographing a product like a router, for example, in situ, in a lifestyle situation, like you mentioned, a living room. I can see, I have a vision of what that would look like with people in the background. That, of course, um, this maybe not necessarily something that somebody could do in their own little studio. Is this something where you'd have to, hire locations, hire models? Does that come into it?
Yeah, and that particular shoot, it's got a budget for it that will allow for that. But not all my shoots are like that. Even though, my background, I said earlier, is I studied photography quite in depth. I did a university degree in Brighton, and then I went to go and assist for 4 or 5 years with an advertising photographer, and then I went on and did my own photography career, which was in fashion photography, mainly in the sort of sphere of hair and beauty, which is studio based. So my skill, as it were, was lighting, and I think and that's what I was known for, that's what people employed me for. And when I worked in America and did hair and beauty, I brought that British. They always said, "Oh, your work is very edgy for a hair photography." And that's what people liked about it. What that means, I'm not quite exactly sure, but there you go. But yeah, so my point I'm making here is, because I think I was skilled in lighting, it's given me the opportunity to photograph anything really, and make it look good. Yeah. Yeah, but but a lot of my work is done in my studio here as well, just against a great background, like you do, Kirsten. Your work, you do headshots, and actors' portraits, don't you?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I could do that anywhere.
Yeah, you
It's
can do it
like,
anywhere.
I prefer to do it in my studio because then I don't have to go anywhere. But yeah, theoretically, I could do that anywhere. Also, okay, I caveat that with, it really depends on how intricate the work needs to be,
Mhm.
because obviously, if you're shooting 100 people, you know, at a company headquarters in a day, your work's not going to be very intricate. Let's put it this way.
No,
That's
it's about getting it done, isn't it? And that's the skill of that particular there. It is to know the timings, knowing when you've got the shot, and then moving on. I mean, I've done it myself, and I know, it's not an easy job.
yeah, it's different skill set become important, and I always say this. As far as headshots are concerned, I always say this, my superpower is not necessarily to take a great headshot. I think that's kind of base level. If you're in this industry, you should be able to light a face and you should be able to take
Yes.
a good headshot.
Yeah.
I think the superpower really comes in, or the real skill comes in to turn people from, when they first come through the door and the first words they utter is, "Oh, I hate having my photo taken,"
Of
y-
course.
to when they leave, um, you want them to think, "Oh, I had a really good experience. This was really fun." That's the skill. So it's much more of a people skill, a human interaction skill than necessarily an actual photographic skill. I think lighting headshot. I don't know. I've been doing it for so long. To
Mm.
me, it's not very difficult. You
No,
know?
it's
Uh,
it's no, it's you look at most headshots and they tend to be of a certain look. It's the soft box, it's the reflector underneath, it's clamshell lighting, a neutral background, and et cetera, et cetera. But as you say, the skill is in getting people who don't want to be photographed looking looking good or good enough to say, yes, I'll sign that photograph off.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, and also, I think with headshots in particular, or with like corporate or business portraiture, let's say, the photo has to tell a story. It has a job. Like for an actor, the job is getting the audition. With a business owner, it might be, selling their business on their website. So
Yes.
these are not random portraits where you can be as creative as you want. Headshots in this scenario really have a very specific function. And this is the thing. It's
And branding photography, is that dialed up a little bit, if I can say that. So when I'm working, even though I might be doing a headshot of somebody I'm doing a brand shoot with, I can use different types of lighting depending on how I want it to look. I might use a beauty dish with a grid. I might use a softbox, etc., etc. It's still a headshot, but I can, because they got a certain role they're trying to to fulfill, or look they're trying to achieve. I can play around with that to try and get that look. So it gives you a bit more creative control because you've got more time with the person. I guess that's the reason why I can able to do that.
What does your pre-production process look like? Like, let's say you have a new client, going to hire you for some branding photography. Um, what's the first step? I presume you get to know their brand, you get to know their story, and what's your first step?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, uh, it's changed and I've developed it over the years, and I've actually the way I've developed it is by doing less and less, um, and letting the people making the process as onerous, at least onerous as possible. To make it as painless as possible. So basically, I asked them a very simple question. Okay, I say, and it's, I said, okay, I can photograph where you are now, where your business is now, but I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is building your brand up and photographing you where you want to be. And by simply saying where you want to be, I'm making my photography aspirational. In fact, my tagline is, I take inspirational people and I make them aspirational, or something. I can't exactly what it is, but it's something like that. You get the idea. So you're basically adding value, is what you're doing. You're saying,
Mm.
okay, I've got the ideas and the visual ideas to put you where you need to be. So that's in the initial conversation, people are telling me what they do, and they say, and I'm just looking for key points. Is the shoot going to be inside? Is it going to be outside? Is it going to be a mixture of both? On location, and then clothing and the wardrobe I leave till a later date, till when I've got the contract. Then I can start talking about clothing. But in the initial conversation, I'm just planting ideas into the client's mind about how it could look, and how aspirational it's going to be. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually it's a really good thing. I'll remember that. This is why I like this show. I learn something every day, so that's a really
And
good.
you learn a lot from doing your own podcast, that's for sure. But
Absolutely.
yes, it's yeah, and so I guess, and maybe we can unpack this later in the show, but I'm all about ideas. That's my thing really, and it comes partly from having studied photography so in depth, and also having lectured in it, because I said I was a senior lecturer in fashion and advertising photography. And at university, it's all about ideas. It's all about coming up with, it's not, people, I see a lot of criticisms of universities, photography degrees, people saying, oh, they never taught me how to run a business or how to even operate a camera or whatever. And I get it, but it's not about about that. The uniqueness of a university degree, photography degree, is that it should give you a grounding in good ideas. And good ideas are where the gold is. Certainly moving forward with the problems with AI or whatever it might be, having good ideas. Forget being, a technician or knowing loads of different things about cameras. Forget all that. That's not going to get you work. What's going to get you work is having good ideas. I guess you could reframe it as problem solving.
Yeah, because the thing about creativity, really, in that context, is that in a sense, anybody could learn how to operate a camera. It's not really difficult. Virtually, you know, 99.999% of human beings can learn how to drive a car. So driving a car is not that difficult.
No.
Being a racing driver or Formula One driver is a very
Yes.
particular skill set that
Yes.
takes a
Very good.
lot more in-depth
Yeah.
training and application, and all the rest of it. It's a little bit like that, because otherwise everybody would be doing their own branding photography. Why wouldn't they? You know, if it was just a matter of if it was just a matter of pressing a button like you do on an iPhone, for example, to get a halfway decent image, then everybody would be doing it. You
Well,
know.
and that can be part of building your brand up as well. There's nothing wrong with that, but certainly, you don't want it to be just be that. You want to have a mix of smorgasbord of different things really to give a different feeling. But yes, ideas are crucial. Like I know, I mean, I'm going to keep referring back to this, and I talk about it a lot on my podcast. I mean, the podcast I run, Shoot to the Top, is two people. It's myself and Sam Hollis. Sam is an expert marketer. He runs a website company for photographers, and he's brilliant at marketing. And he talks about marketing. I talk about the aesthetics of photography. So there's always a little battle between the two of us about, he's always trying to push the marketing side. I'm always trying to push, oh, you don't need to be marketing. Well, you should be doing more than marketing. You should be learning about photography and taking a good photograph and coming up with good ideas.
Yeah, I think that's always the thing. Um, in a world where everybody has an iPhone or everybody has a smartphone, let's say, everybody
Yes.
has, a camera in their pocket. Um, I bet there are going to be a lot of people out there thinking, well, branding photography, it sounds like a fun thing to do, but is it really still relevant? Is it still something that's needed, or is there still a market for it, or is that market declining because of the advent of smartphone cameras, AI, um, and all of that kind of stuff?
The personal brand, as I said earlier, is something that is fairly recent for everybody. In the olden days, only rock stars or film idols had a personal brand. But these days, with the internet, where everybody's has got a space on the internet, a voice on the internet, be a business or private, um, there's been a growth in the personal brand. Um, so in my view, I think there's space for that to keep on growing, and I think there's more and more people are starting off as self-employed, or wanting to do their own thing and get out of and change. That certainly happened in COVID. Um, Branding, for companies is growing because it's becoming more a competitive marketplace out there. So companies are always looking for that edge. So my view is that it's a growing business, and I would really encourage people to explore if they're looking to look for photography careers to explore the personal branding space.
You mentioned your background is in fashion photography.
Uh-huh.
Um, So if I relate that back to, let's say, to branding photography, is branding photography something that is dependent on trends, like fashion is? I'm thinking, one year flared jeans are in, the next year it's skinny jeans. Um, is that something that you need to be aware of as a photographer? Do you need to be sort of at the spear tip of changing
Mm.
trends, or how does that work in that field?
Oh, that's a great question, Kirsten. And my answer, the simple answer to it, yes, it is. It is fashion based. It is led by trends. As photography is generally, isn't it? I mean, let's think of a photography. Okay, let's take that word that I can't stand actually, bokeh or bokeh. I mean, we used to call it out of focus. I don't know how it suddenly become bokeh, but there you go. Back in my day when I was studying photography in the early 90s, we were shooting on film, and I was really everything we shot was f8. Because the background, especially with portraits, we call it environmental portrait. The background was part of the visual story, was part of the narrative. It was all equally important. So everything had was in focus, as it were, equal weight. A modern trend in the last 10 years with digital cameras that can shoot wide open very easily and with very accurate auto focusing has made that people have the blurry backgrounds. Um, Now, I see that as a trend that's dying now because phones can do it, and all of a sudden it looks really boring, doesn't it? It doesn't look eye-catching anymore. So I think there's a trend going back to more, stronger depth of fields, etc. So that's the sort of trend that if that's where you're talking about trends in photography that I've noticed. In personal branding photography, I think there's been a trend for very overlit, very bright and overexposed images, again, with backgrounds that are quite blurry. I see that changing, with more lighting coming in, more contrast coming in, um, and a bit more darker, dare I say, not darker mood, but like a little bit more vibe to it, but edgier. That's the word I was looking for, that but edgier.
It's
So
interesting
yeah,
that
there are trends.
It's interesting that you say that because I've noticed that, in my headshot work, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember when when I first started shooting headshots, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, something like that.
Okay. Yep. Yep.
It was all about the very bright, Peter Hurley look.
Yes.
It was
Yes.
the, like, the really catchy eyes and the, like, the even
Yep.
lighting and, that kind of very, very present, very flat lit in a sense.
Very flat lighting.
Yeah,
He sold that look so well. He is
absolutely.
so brilliant. He defined the genre of headshot
Yeah,
photography without a doubt.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And and there's something to it. The thing is, as always, when it comes to trends, overexposure leads to people trying to find alternatives. That's
Yes.
usually the thing. And so, what I find now, and of course, when I first started doing headshots, I tried to emulate that trend. I tried to emulate it, but I didn't try to copy it. I think what I always try to do was I tried to emulate it, but I tried to kind of just find my own way of doing it and
Uh-huh.
inject a little bit of personality into it. Um, but what I find now is virtually almost in every session, um, my clients like to really go for the darker looks, the edgier looks, the
The
moodier
dark
looks,
side. The
you know,
dark side.
the dark side. Yes, exactly. I've pulled them over to the dark side. And I really prefer shooting that too. You know, I've
Yeah,
I've
definitely.
really moved away from white backgrounds. I actually personally, and I know
Mm,
sometimes you have to do it, but
mm.
I personally really dislike white backgrounds nowadays.
I agree. I agree. Yeah, they're not great for skin tones, aren't they?
No, they're
Uh,
horrible.
yeah, that's right. They make people, and especially if you overlight a background. I mean, back in the day, again, like when I started shooting in the mid-90s on my Hasselblad, shooting a white background was a real art. There were people who could do it really well, and there's different types of white backgrounds. It's like a super white, there's a warm white, and so there's a real skill to it. But the one thing I discovered very quickly when shooting white backgrounds, because I was doing that with hair, you need a big studio to photograph a white background properly. A really big studio. You can't do it in an office space or on a home studio. You need lots of space. Otherwise, the white just the backlight just flares everywhere into the camera around,
Yeah.
and it becomes that kind of look.
Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platypod tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps. Yeah, exactly. It is, very
Yes.
quickly, your head literally looks stuck on to what
Yeah,
it's just.
I've seen it done very badly. I mean, Peter Hurley does it very well, but that's because 'cause he's got quite a big studio, um, and he's dialed it in correctly because you've got to be very critical with that. But sorry, I interrupted there. You were talking about white background and the trend away from that, weren't you?
Yeah. So what I find is, because often what I tend to do is, I've run through a number of different setups, and I create different looks and different options. And what I do find is that my clients are always drawn to the darker
Mhm.
shots. The ones that show a little bit more um mystique, maybe. Something where because I like quite dark shadows personally.
Right, yeah, I mean, this this I know you're saying, I had to s if I can just say a word of caution. When you look at your when you're editing a photograph, and we've all got lovely big screens, I've got one right by me here, I use Capture One, nice big screen and all that, and you edit the photograph, and you've got the right exposure, and then you look at it really small, and it goes darker. It's an optical illusion, isn't it?
Yeah.
when things are smaller, they look darker. So I would say, you have to be a little bit careful because when people do look at your headshots and they're really small, like a circle these days, which is really annoying, by the way. I find very annoying how it
Yeah.
ended up being a beautiful square into a
Yeah.
circle. But there we go. That's another thing altogether. But you have to be, and when I do my headshots, I try and make them as contrasty. Yes, I have dark shadows, but I also make them contrasty, ideally with a beauty dish, because it
Yes.
makes it really pop out on a LinkedIn profile, for example, when you've got lots of headshots. The contrasty ones uh, pop out when they're small, is my point I'm making.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, and you're absolutely right. And this is actually a really good test for people to do when when you're editing your headshot. Is actually just reduce the size of that on your screen. Have a look at what it looks like when it's really small, and if it's still impactful, then
Yes.
you know then that's great. Um, Same thing is true for thumbnails, by the way. Anybody designing thumbnails for their YouTube videos, do the
Mm,
same thing
mm. Yeah, exactly.
because
Exactly. You can get a little bit when you're looking on a big screen, it's it doesn't quite translate to looking at it tiny on a phone. So
well,
it's
especially when you're on a high resolution screen,
yeah.
I I edit on a 5K screen. It's a
Oh wow.
beautiful screen. It's an absolutely beautiful, stunning. Everything looks stunning on it. But I remember, I had a career in music before I went into
Oh man, we
photography.
haven't even started on Kirsten.
Oh yeah,
We
we
haven't even
could be.
started on that. We have to be careful here because I had a career in music before I did photography.
Yes, I know that. I've read that, and this is the thing. This is an interesting thing because a lot of my guests here on the show have
Yeah.
had either have had a career in music or are also musicians.
Yeah. It's a good one, isn't it? It's a good one. It's very true. It's a quite a strong link.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I used to do back in the day, this takes me back to the '90s or something.
Uh-huh.
You know, I used to record in a studio. And of course,
Ah, yes.
you listen back to
Yes.
you have near field monitors, you have
Yeah. Yeah.
bigger monitors. Everything sounds great in the studio. We,
Amazing. On a big old 15-inch monitor. Yeah. It's like, oh
yeah,
wow,
exactly.
turn it up.
And so what I used to do is I used to run a copy on a tape back in the days, a
Very
cassette
good.
tape, and I would take it to the car and then I would
Right.
play it in the car stereo, and if it still sounded balanced, and if it still sounded good in there, then I knew it was the mix was good. But more often than not, you would very quickly realize that something would stick out, whether it was the vocals or whether it was whatever, the snare or but the hi-hat very often, peaks
That's
out
right.
like, and
Yeah.
then obviously you
Or
go
you've
back to
lost the bass. The worst thing
yes,
possible, you've lost the bass.
yes, exactly, yeah.
But that was
So
the idea. You had the NS10s then, didn't you? The near field monitors, so
yeah,
you
correct,
can
yeah,
do that in the studio, which were like really cheap monitors, but it gave you an
yeah.
idea. And the
They
Auratone, some of the Auratone ones as well, the little ones, they were quite cute little monitors.
See, I always like the NS10s.
The
This is
NS10,
like
yeah.
we're going off into like
I knew
a
we'd
music
do this.
tangents,
Better be careful.
but that's okay. So the Yamaha NS10s, I used to love them. And I used to love them
Mm.
for two reasons. First of all, they actually sounded pretty trashy,
That's the
which
whole point.
was the point, yeah. And so it sounded much more like they would sound in my car, and I had a really crappy car at the time with a terrible stereo, which was from a comparison point of view, it actually made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But what I did like was and this is a trick I learned from a German engineer I used to work with a lot. When you've spent hours mixing, and your ears really get tired, and you get
Mm,
that ear hearing fatigue, and all of a sudden you can't, you've got a real problem hearing the higher frequencies properly
yeah.
and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, I used to stick a piece of paper, like sellotape a piece of paper in front of the monitors, and it would balance out what you would hear, and all of a sudden you'd have like a much more balanced spectrum.
Oh,
Yeah, it really worked. I used to
that
do
is
that.
a good idea. That is a good idea.
Although, of course, in retrospect, when your ears get tired, it's probably a sign that you should give it a rest. I mean,
Yeah, my ears are shot now, especially because being a bass player, my right ear, which because I stand by the hi-hat, the drummer's
yeah,
hi-hat, is as because that's where the time is for the, as
yeah,
a bass player, you wanna hook in with the drummer, that's where the time is. That is the worst thing possible because it's like really, really batters your eardrums, and I'm
yeah,
completely deaf in one, well, not completely, but
yeah, the
very deaf.
same. I don't even really want to.
What made you switch from music to photography then, Kirsten?
So photography is basically it's kind of family trait. My dad was a photographer. My grandmother was a
Ah,
photographer, so it goes back a long
oh,
time.
wow. Okay.
Um, but I used to run a music school,
Yeah.
and back in 2013. Well, actually, so back end of 2012, I decided I had to make some life changing changes. And one of the things I did was I sold my music school, uh, and and I went back to Germany and hung out with with my mom, um, for a little bit, for a few weeks. And as I was contemplating what my next step was going to be, my mom said, I think you should buy yourself a camera. Worked for your dad and it worked for your grandma, and I'm pretty sure it's going to work for you. And I immediately thought, that sounds like a great idea, you know? And plus, again, I say that, I caveat that. Um, when I was a kid, I used to make movies. I used to make videos. I had a video camera at a time, and I spent my entire teenage years making video movies. Um, and the reason for that was very simple. I just wanted to rebel against all the stills photographer in my
Ah,
family, you know?
no, I see.
And,
I
I
see, I
kinda thought,
see.
like, I wanna be the next Steven Spielberg or, the next George
Well, he
Lucas or something.
started off with home movies, didn't he? When he
Yeah.
was very young, and his home movies were, like, incredible. They were just like Close Encounter. He filmed Close Encounters virtually all the best effects when he was a kid. He worked it all out.
Exactly, and, this was my thing actually when I was in my teens. I loved special effects or practical effects in particular. I really loved that.
Yes, practical
Um,
effects.
and, I love the thinking, and so a lot of the stuff that I shot were basically effect shots, that weren't. There was a story, but not really a story. Like, my wife went to film school, and her thing is script writing. So when we talk story, we talk very differently about storylines.
Right.
She's really involved in the dialogue and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm more like, I really like the lighting in this shot. This is great.
Yeah, it's like the lyrics or the chords, isn't it? Or the groove, isn't it? What you into, the lyrics of the
Yeah,
song or you into the groove of the song, isn't it?
exactly. And this is like, I say this all the time. This is true. Actually, we only had the very same conversation only a couple nights ago. What were we watching? Oh, we were watching Casablanca. That's
Oh,
right.
right, okay, yes.
Yeah, we're watching
Wow, okay,
Casablanca, but my
gosh.
wife's never seen it. I thought, okay, well, I love classic movies, so
Yeah, that's a
like,
great
okay,
movie.
let's watch it. That's cool. One of the greatest movies ever made. Oh my god.
Yeah, it is no,
Beautifully
it's
lit.
on the top there. It's renowned as one of the best movies ever made, isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah,
as you
it's
say.
beautifully lit. It's like, it's a
Beautiful.
film noir.
Terroir. Yep.
It's really, I love it. I love it. We watched it together, and she quit halfway through. She goes, "The dialogue is terrible. The acting is wooden." It's
How
like,
how
what?
dare she? How
I know.
dare! Oh,
I know, and
divorce
there's
the
nothing.
divorce proceedings are on the way.
I know, there's nothing I can say, to sway your opinion, but fine, but it actually proves the point that you made earlier, um, we're different, and some people put the emphasis on different things. They're looking out for different things, and
Mm,
this is I
mm.
think this is what makes, creative endeavors like music, like film, or like photography so amazing because it creates that incredible variety of things that some people like to create incredible macro flower images, you know, and other people don't really care very much about flowers, like myself. But
Well, it's but nevertheless though, I mean, I think you should photograph if you should try photograph everything. I photograph flowers with
yeah,
macro and I love it. There's nothing more meditative, than
yeah,
going around to my local park and photographing the flowers, especially with like
yeah,
different light and hard contrast light or soft light.
yeah.
And yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's funny this, I mentioned earlier, I used to rebel, against my grandmother and my dad. So my grandmother shot in black and white exclusively, back in the 30s and 40s. And my dad, well, my dad shot both black and white and color, but all film, obviously, back in those days.
Of course.
And I remember I grew up and I used to think, throughout the 80s, I used to think like, oh, black and white. Who shoots black and white? What was the whole point in this? It's like where color's been invented. What's the point in shooting black and white, right? And I tell you what, until the first Gulf War.
Oh,
And so what happened during the first Gulf War was that I used to live in Germany at the time, and in Germany, cable television and stuff existed, but my parents didn't have it. Right, my parents just had like three basic TV channels, They were not interested in getting cable or whatever. I don't think you had satellite TV back then, but, like, they weren't
Well,
interested
you
in cable
similar
TV.
similar story to the UK, really, of course, we didn't, we only had one channel up till the 1980s.
Yeah,
Bit more
and
than that.
so, so these 3 channels was all that we had. Um, and of course, on those 3 channels, because they were, like, public broadcasters, they would stop broadcasting at about, I don't know, 1 AM or something, and then this plate would come up and, it would start again at, I don't know, 5:30 in the morning or something, um, until the first Gulf War. And during that time, they would run a news bulletin every hour, just an update, right, all through the night. And so
Mhm.
they would
Yeah.
fill up the time in between with
Yes.
classic movies, with classic black and white
Oh,
movies.
okay.
Like all the old MGM stuff, the David Niven stuff, all of that, all of these, the pendulum of death or whatever it is, like the whole shebang. Um, all of the old Paramount stuff, because I think all of that stuff, which I've recently learned, all of that stuff was out of licensing or whatever, out of copyright. So they
Oh, I
basically just
see, so they could show it.
they could just show it.
Mm.
And this all happened right in the middle of the school holidays. And I was like, "Whoa, okay. I'm, like, totally gonna stay up all night and watch TV," you know? And once I started doing that, I really got into those black and white movies, and I've loved black and white movies ever since, and especially that time period, it just has a special sort of place in my heart. I just love the look of it. I like the really tinny audio. I just love it. It's like there's
Oh,
something.
okay, you do okay, that's quite a fetish you've got there, I
Oh,
imagine, the
absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
audience.
yeah. Yeah, it's kind of, it works, with the whole thing because, often, they weren't, like, a lot of the time they weren't as sharp as we would expect,
Mm.
especially from the early 30s, like late
Of
20s,
course.
early 30s. Things weren't quite as sharp. Um, the audio was obviously very tinny back then, given how they recorded stuff. The acting was very theater, quite like very like, what's the word? Very boxy and like,
Yeah.
not like
Yes. Yeah, yeah.
so this was still the early days of film, basically, in a sense. But I just loved it. I loved the storylines. There wasn't a lot of action. A lot of it was exposition. A lot of it was just dialogue. Because a lot of those movies were shot on sound stages, with sometimes with no on
Right.
location work or whatever.
Yeah.
And so they had to tell a story much like you would do in a theater, on different sets essentially. And I really fell in love with those movies. So yeah. So and now, of course, I love shooting black and white. There you go. It's come full circle.
Did you shoot black and white film, or do you just convert it digitally?
So I do shoot black and white film. So that's something I do, not professionally, but I love doing it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but I also started mimicking that on digital. Um, but I turned the whole workflow into black and white. So although I shoot raw, um, the entire workflow is in black and white. So what I see through the viewfinder is black and white. What pops up on my screen, so do shoot tethered, is also black and white.
Yes. I should
Um,
have it
and so the entire workflow is black and white.
black and white. I got it. Like those Leica black and white cameras, which are very odd.
Yeah, a little bit like that, but it's basically because, and I know, I've spoken to many photographers who basically shoot, normal inverted commas and then convert into black and white afterwards. I see the point. There's no problem with that for me at all. It's just
Yeah.
I like to
It
see the image in black and white when I
No,
look through the
totally.
viewfinder.
Totally. I get that
So
totally. Yeah, yeah, for sure. And well, it's great that you're doing film as well, so you can compare the two, because I think often people, unless you've been involved in a darkroom and seeing, and understanding contrast and understanding maybe even the zone system or whatever, or different papers, there's a lot to learn. And it's not just a question of desaturating it, is now it's black and white.
yeah, and that's exactly it. And he light things. So this is the thing I've learned, and I'm by no means, you know, I'm no George Horrell, but um I just I light things differently when I see them in black and white. This is the
Yes.
that's
Yes.
the thing. So,
Yes. You can do.
um,
Definitely. 100%.
so
Yeah.
it's just to me that's why it makes sense for me is to keep that whole workflow in black and white.
It's a
Now,
sh Sorry, just before on that black and white, I mean, it's, it's I'm surprised black and white photography, even though people love black and white photography. I remember I did a LinkedIn post about this, how people like, but they were never black and white portraits or black and white business for my brand new world is just not really requested or done really, which is a bit of a
Yes.
shame, I think. I think there's a bit of a, I'm hoping one day to do a black and white photo shoot for somebody. I'm sure I will do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've only ever really sold one black and white headshot, I have to say,
That's right,
and
exactly. Yeah.
it worked in this particular context. It perfectly worked. It was a CEO of a company. You know, it was a pinstripe suit. Um, it's a very sharp shot. It worked 100%. It was perfect. It had a classic, timeless um vibe to it,
Well, it's
and
evocative, isn't it? That is it. Black and white is so evocative. It's so,
yeah,
and people do love it. They say, "Oh, I love black and white," but yes, but for the commercial world or the business world, it's not quite crossed over there yet. Yeah.
yes, yeah. Well, one can only hope. This is your trends. Trends. Let's start a new
Exactly. There
trend.
you go. That's a good point.
Um, so how do you guide clients um to make them feel comfortable when you're shooting them, especially when you're shooting people who are not necessarily used to being photographed, like let's say a business owner who needs branding photography for their business. What's your process to make people feel relaxed and natural in front of the camera?
Yeah, that's another good question. When I used to, I said earlier, I was a fashion photographer, and so obviously, um, people were being paid to be photographed. I mean, and part of the business, a model was a job that, and they wanted to be photographed. When I started getting into doing branding photography, and I was quite surprised that people didn't want to be photographed. I thought, you don't want to be photographed? What is that? So I was first of all quite shocked over it. Once I got over that, I sort of developed these three techniques, and I guess what we're talking about here is posing people, isn't it? Really, for want of a better word. I'm not very keen on that word, but let's just go with that. And, I've developed this three-part system. Um, Let me see if I can remember what it is now. We got there's mirroring, observation, and I think a third one is empathy. Mirroring is basically, one I got from, do you remember Richard Avedon did that book called The American West, of those beautiful portraits of, that he did that were like 6 foot and were shown in a gallery back in the 1970s and 80s. I went to go to his archive over in Fort Worth in Texas when I was working there once. And they keep all his notes about how he did the shoots and so on and so forth. And he talks about how he would get these people who weren't models, um, and he would basically get them to pose in a certain way by like crossing his arms, and he had such an empathy with them that they would cross their arms as well. Or he'd tilt his head and they tilt their head in the same way as well. So that's, without people realizing it, you can get them to do what you want by doing those things. So that's mirroring. Observation is another one that I use. And so that's really just really hyper focusing when somebody comes in and watching what they do, um, and saying, okay, and just say, okay, that looks really good. Do that again. They say, "Well, you did this or do that," and just being really aware of any natural things that they do, so it doesn't look posed. And the third one is not is and empathy is part of that, and the third one is direction. It's just come back to me. And direction is basically where you tell people what to do, rather like Peter Hurley does. He's very, very good at directing people and making them feel comfortable about it and making a joke about it, but it doesn't work. Or maybe even, that's part of it. The joke is part of what he wants to do, really. So, yeah. Oh, excuse me, my head's gone a bit funny there. That's caused that size. I am looking at the screen. I'm back to front. So yeah, does that answer your question? Those
Yeah,
two, sort of three little things there. So we got observation, mirroring, and direction. I
yeah.
brought. So is there like little tools you've got around you, little tool that you can draw from your tool bag? I might use all three of them with a subject, or I might just use one, or all different times. Yes,
Peter Hart is a really good example when it comes to direction because he's
yes.
his direction is so personality driven. I've met Peter a number of times.
Oh, have you
Um,
really?
yeah, yeah, and his personality is exactly as you would see it
Yeah.
on a video. He's just exactly the same guy, like on and off camera. Um, he's super friendly, very helpful,
Mm,
and really funny, and just slightly larger than life character. But
I
it's
can imagine.
exactly what you see is exactly what you get. No matter whether you're like in a speakeasy whiskey bar or or on the expo floor or whatever. So it's it's and that's I think that that really works. You know, if if you can utilize your personality to to motivate your subject to basically do what you wanted to do.
Exactly, but you don't have to be outgoing to be a portrait photographer, there's different techniques. I mean, with Peter Hurley, have you ever seen any of his early work, his black and white photography at all?
Yes, I have.
It
Yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't show it very often. He's very quite hard to seek out, but it's identical to his later work for a start, isn't it? He really had set in stone his style from a very early start to his a very early part of his career, didn't he? With the heads being cut off and the square, the square frame or the subject in the middle of the frame, all those kind of things,
Yeah.
those Hurleyisms, as it were, he developed from a very early part in his career.
What do you think the, because I have to ask this question, what do you think the impact of AI is going to have on things like, branding photography?
Mm. Well, my thoughts on this do change on a daily basis, depending on what I've looked at that day, I have to say. Overall, and we have had, like you have, I'm sure, quite a few guests talking about AI on our podcast. Overall, I'm not too feel too threatened by it. Um, in my 30 plus career as a photographer, I have seen things come, go, and stay, be it, I don't know, what would it be? The digital camera, the iPhone, you know, roll film taking over from sheet film. Okay, I'm not quite as far back as that, but there's always different things as threats that come along, and AI certainly is another threat that has come along. So it seems to be getting better all the time. People do say it's reached a peak and it's not gonna get any better. I don't know. Um, I think what can I say? I mean, I think if going back to my earlier conversation about ideas, I think if you've got good ideas, you don't need to worry about AI. And in some ways, just being a photographer these days is not enough. You've got to be the buzzword, isn't it? Is a content creator. You've got to be a creative art director as opposed to just a photographer. So, within that, you might have video, gifts. I make gifts for my clients. I do all, different parts of my package, d- which I do because I enjoy doing that, not to stay ahead of AI, but I think that's one way of staying ahead of AI is having good ideas and being flexible in your approach.
That's actually a really good point because, of course, when it comes to promoting yourself or your own business, sales photography is uh, it's as important as it's always been. But of course, with the advent of social media, advertising, and social media platforms and all the rest of it, video has become a lot more important than it's ever been.
Yeah.
So for somebody setting themselves up in branding photography, how important do you think is it to also have the video skills to go with it?
Mm. If when I speak to my students, I mix sort and when I was a lecturer at university, which is like 10 years ago, we encouraged students to do video as part of their practice, so I've always been pro video and pro, you know, it's just a means of getting your ideas across. And yes, you're right, video is uber popular at the moment, isn't it? It just seems to be that, the buzzword of photography, it just seems to be the sort of second cousin at the back there, so I'm trying to get a look in. But with photography, I can go and do a face shoot with my client, and they can come up with a year's worth of imagery in about an afternoon. In an afternoon shoot, a morning shoot, they come up with about 100 different images that will last them for a year of social media, websites, whatever. With a video, you've got one video, you can cut it up a little bit, but you've still only got one video. And I think when clients, when you can use that approach and how adaptable photography is, it's still super, super strong. So my simple answer to that is yes, video is popular, but photography still has a mighty place to play.
Yeah, it's I think that's a generally a misconception is I think that people often tend to think, oh well, stills photography is dead because video is all the rage, and what's the point in stills photography? But as you say, you're absolutely right. You can create a whole ton of imagery that will last you for the rest of the year in you know a morning or at least a day.
A day, let's say
Whilst
a day, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
whilst video, of course, is a lot more involved. There's not only the shooting stage, but there's also the editing stage, and you can only regurgitate it so much. Um, until it runs out of its usefulness, and then you have to start over again. Um, which is, I think,
Yeah,
as a creator, is probably a good thing if you have a client who's willing to pay.
yeah.
You know?
Well, a video obviously is also, I guess, more expensive than photography, isn't it? Really, because I don't know why that has achieved that in this, but it certainly is more because people think. I think people think there's more of a mystique to video. Oh, the editing is gonna, but we edit in photography as well. We have to edit our stills. That takes time. We've
Yeah.
still got the same camera. We've got the same lighting equipment, really. But video seems to be able to sort of bypass all that, and you know, my friends who do video seem to have a higher day rate than I do.
Yeah, I mean, video is an interesting thing. I actually just did a video shoot last night, where I
Oh,
shot a band.
cool.
And it took, I don't know, 5 hours. We only shot really a verse and a chorus of a particular track because that's all they needed for their promotional campaign. Um, and it's fun because you can be with that kind of stuff. You can be super creative, and for once, it was a band and there was actually a budget, which doesn't happen very often. That kind of
Well,
thing.
that's for sure. Yep.
But it's one of these things where you can be super creative, with camera moves, with lighting, and all the rest of it. Um, so yeah, I like doing videos. I like doing video
Yeah,
shoots.
I get it, and,
It's super
look,
fun.
I'm an old geezer, I've been in the game for a long time, I'm moving more into education, but certainly if I was starting off, again, a video would definitely be without a doubt, video would well, I'd be more of an I'd be setting myself as an art director, more about
Yeah.
coming up with, and you can get these people in, you can just employ people to do the videos or the photography, or do the photography and get a technician in, It's ideas are crucial to all of this.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Actually, that it sort of brings us back to what you said at the beginning of this conversation is where it's based on the ideas. If you have good ideas, then that's really what's going to sell. What's going to sell you as a photographer or as a video artist. Um, I want to come back to something that you just mentioned, education. So you said you're moving into education. Tell me a little bit about your educational courses and platforms.
Gladly, thank you, and thanks for asking. As you said earlier, my background, I'm a senior lecturer in photography, and I've taught photography at a very high level for about 10 years, and my master's is in education as well. So, I've always been teaching and always interested in getting across, and helping people and getting the message out there. And so I've come up with this, and let me say how this started. I've heard it said so many times when on the business side of photography, it's all about marketing. It's all about marketing. Photography is not important. 10% of his photography, 90% is marketing. And I sort of get that. Yeah, of course. And I spend a lot of time building up my branding photography, doing marketing. But my clients come back to me, not because I do fantastic LinkedIn posts or whatever. They come back to me because I'm a good photographer and they like my photographs and I've got a vision, I've got good ideas. Going back to what I said earlier, it's not about, I'm not photographing where you are now, I'm photographing where you want to be. So I've come up with this, uh, I don't know, what do you call it, a package or a teaching platform. That's entitled The Idea of Ideas. So it's all about how do you come up with good ideas. And I've drilled this down into 3 areas, which I'll go through with you, if that's okay. Um, the first one is I call cultural awareness, and it's about being engaged in the world. So, it's knowing about films, like with movies. It's knowing, obviously, photography. It's knowing, going to galleries, knowing the history of photography. It's about reading books, it's about looking at album covers, all these things, all the cultural media, it's about being aware of it. It's, being aware of trends, as you said earlier, being aware of typography. All these things come into the package about how you get good ideas. So my point I was saying here is that you should spend time investing in learning these how to come up with these good ideas. So creative cultural awareness is one. The second one is creative thinking. And I've identified what I call the five R's, the letter R of creative thinking. And they basically are research, rules. So the rules are broken up into, let me see, it's learning the rules, breaking the rules and then making up your own rules, which is basically style. The third, so we got research rules. The third part is repetition, doing it over and over again. And then reflection, looking at it and critically looking at your work and thinking what is good and what is not good and being critical about it, not putting it on Facebook and asking people what they think about it because you're always going to get loads of likes on there from your family. Worthless, I'm afraid. And the fifth and the fifth element is rest. So it's basically about absorbing, being open to absorb all these, what is going about you and to come up and being able to come up with ideas. The third bit is the bit that I'm doing my workshops on, which is basically the technological toolkit. And these are all the things that will give you the tools to be able to come up with ideas, the skills, as it were. So this would be, lighting, camera lenses, posing. We've already talked about that a little bit already. Editing your images. All these are the skills that you can dig into that will help you come up with creative thinking. So I've basically put together a workshop, a 2-day workshop here in Bristol, which I'm doing in the end of September, and a 3-day workshop in San Miguel in Mexico in March of next year. And yeah, so that's my next move. I'm moving more into education, so I'm quite excited about that. And this whole backlash about it's not all just about marketing. Yes, marketing is important, but hey, I started off when I first picked up a camera, I knew I wanted to be a photographer. I didn't think, "Oh, I wanna make loads of money and become a photographer." I just wanted to take good photographs, and I still do that. That is still my motivation to take good photographs and
Yes,
get paid for it.
well,
Of course,
yeah. I mean,
of
that's
course.
I think the vast majority of photographers that I know, got into photography not because they thought, "Oh, this is a great way to get rich," you
No,
know, um, because, it isn't, but, because they felt the love for creating imagery, that's the thing, and of course, as I always say, photography is like a spectrum. Some people are more technically minded. Some people are more creative.
yeah.
Some people are somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. But wherever you are on that spectrum, photography can be extremely satisfying. For what you do. Um, I always notice that a lot of the time when I speak in camera clubs, for example, I find
Oh, yes. That's right.
that
Yes.
I end up speaking in front of a very technically minded
Yes, that's correct.
crowd.
Exactly. Very technically minded, and believe me, I am not a technical. Certainly not as cameras. Lenses, I'm interested in lenses and lighting certainly, but cameras, they bore me. They're all the same. Every camera is the same, no matter what anybody says. Camera's got 5 functions, and they all have these 5 functions, and
Yeah, absolutely.
that's all
I tell you what,
yeah.
a funny thing is I came across a video earlier today. Apparently, Nikon have released firmware 3.0 for the Z8 or something, and I'm like, oh, okay, this could be interesting. I don't know, maybe there's something. I listened to the whole thing. Not one feature in there makes any difference for me whatsoever.
No,
you know,
no, it's a no, they're all the same. But lenses, I'm very interested in lenses, and I can talk about lenses and very happy to talk about lenses. But the difference between a mirrorless and a DSLR camera, or even a film camera, is minimal.
yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's as I'm getting more and more into different formats, I realize that large format photography is sort of in my head. This is the next level. Um,
Oh yes. Well,
but
okay. If we're talking about formats, that is something that is interesting because square format, 16:9, like the old Mamiya camera they used to do, or 6:7 camera, or 6:6, they all that makes you photograph and the subject and look at the world in a particularly different way. That does change. But unfortunately, Kirsten, all modern cameras seem to only don't give you the option, do they, to shoot in different formats? It's all basically 4 by 3 by 4, isn't it?
so that's an interesting thing, actually. As my listeners and viewers know, because I've talked about it lots of times. I do a project called Three Heads in a Row, which is basically sort of a goofy portrait project that I like doing. You know, just this kind of it's a bit of a caricature, that kind of comical kind of portraits, but I shoot them all in square format. They're all square.
Lovely.
Um, what I've started doing it
You shoot them
originally.
in square. Sorry, you shoot them in square or you edit them to square.
So originally, I basically the end product is square. And so for a long time, I used to shoot them just in standard, and then I used to crop them and perfect. And now I like to shoot them in square because on
Mm.
on my camera I could change the format. So I
Oh,
can
you got the
actually
Fuji, you got the Fuji. Is it someone told me this. There's a Fuji that does square, isn't it?
well, this is mine is a Nikon, it's a Nikon Z8, and you can
Oh,
change.
okay, so it's mirrorless cameras that are doing it.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
you can change the
okay.
you can change the format in it. Because what I actually find is this is exactly the same. It kind of brings me back to what we were talking about earlier about black and white workflow. I just like to see things in the way that they in their
Are
sort of
intended.
final.
Are
Yeah,
intended.
exactly how they intended, and
Of
it's
course.
thing. And I'd really highly recommend that, for people to try that out, and maybe change or shoot in different formats. There's actually one thing I've also noticed, when it comes to my headshot clients, is that, of course, when I create the final headshot, I create different crops for it, because I know that my clients will use these images in different scenarios. So that's the standard, the traditional 8 by 10, or 4 by 5, whatever you can call it. Um, the traditional portrait format. There's also the landscape 8 by 10 Peter Hurley kind of format. But then what I like to
Mhm.
do is a 16 by 9
Yeah, that's right.
cinematic
Yeah, I
format.
bet you do. Yeah, of course you do. Yeah.
And that always
Eh,
goes down really well
yeah, yeah,
with my
yeah.
clients. And I know it's not a particularly flexible format, so people won't be able to use it in as many different scenarios. But it's a really fun crop to have because it looks great. It does have a lot of negative space, so actually it looks great on a billboard. You have plenty of negative
That's
space
where it
for it.
comes from. It's billboard, and that's what my
Yeah,
background in advertising.
right.
Yeah, and I still do. I'm 100% with you on Kirsten. This is like two kindred souls talking together here about cropping, about the crop. When I did my degree, photography degree, editorial photography, I used shooting with my Hasselblad, a square format camera, 6 by 6, and my
Oh, nice.
finished work was triptychs, was 3 squares put together, and this was how each image was displayed.
That
So
incidentally is actually exactly what I do in the
yeah,
three heads in a row
yeah,
product. It's because it's basically three images of the same person
yes,
interacting with three different objects.
yeah,
It's
that's
always a
exactly.
triptych. Yeah.
And it just looks fantastic. It's a great format, and and I love the square. But now when I'm working with my branding clients, as most of my work is either done for for websites, I guess. Um, a format that I use a lot is the 2 by 1 or 1.9 1 by 1, or certainly let's just say the skinny long image.
Yeah.
And you have to practice that. That is not a thing that you can do easily on a camera because well, I don't know why, but there's various reasons why, I guess, but it's something you have to practice. And again, looking at films and movies, is a great way of looking at how headshots can be done in a long 1 by 9 1 or whatever it might be, 2-to-1 ratio, or even 3-to-1 ratio.
Yeah.
Looking at movies, they've got it because they use really long lenses to do it. Really, really long lenses, don't they? I think that's what they do in the
Yeah, yeah,
movies.
absolutely. And it's also just, it's placement, it's creating that space and letting the to me as a portrait photographer, it's letting the subject breathe, rather than boxing it in,
Yeah.
which I find to me, weirdly, to me, the traditional portrait crop is almost offensive. The passport
What
photo.
what oh, the passport photo. Oh, yeah, okay, yes.
You know what
Well,
I
I
mean?
don't know. Look, yeah, that's interesting. Do you know well, Germany is actually one of the you look at Germany in the 1980s, and you're looking at Thomas Struve and Thomas Ruff. Uh, I don't know if you know those 2 photographers.
Yeah.
They had a style, didn't they? A Dorfman School, I think it was a Dorfman School of Photography, where they did these very objective portraits. It's a shame I haven't got anything to show you. This is where
Yeah.
But anyhow, they were made for the gallery, and they were like big portraits of people's headshots, which were based on passport type style photos because it
Yeah.
was seen as objective. Of course, it's not objective. There's nothing objective in photography. It's all totally subjective.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, do you
that's
know who I'm talking about? So, Kirsten, is that something you're aware of? These German photographers?
yes, I have heard of them before, yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. This is why I think it's important to know the history of photography because it all feeds into your imagination, and it does
Absolutely.
surprise me how. people don't know the history of it, and it's not a difficult history to know well because it's only 120 years. It's not like learning painting, which is like thousands of years.
That's true, and actually, also a super interesting source of inspiration. I've just actually only about a week ago, I took a trip to the National Portrait Gallery in London.
Ah, yes.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
with my daughter, and it was super interesting. It's yeah, it was fun. It's actually fun for her. I thought she would be a little bit bored, but actually, she loved it. That's great. So highly recommend that. Now, let's move on. Let's talk about shoot to the top.
Oh.
Your podcast. Tell me a little bit about or give me the sort of a helicopter view over what your podcast is about.
It's a show aimed at commercial photographers, and it's hosted by myself and Sam. Sam is a marketing expert, and I'm a photography expert. And it's basically each show is a battle about between each of us about what is more important about getting more business. So that's what it's about. And of course, we have a lot of guests on as well, and it's a great way of meeting people. Um, so yes, that's what it is. It's a show for commercial photographers, branding in particular, I guess.
Right. How do you? What was the initial thing about it? How did you get it started?
Great question. It, um, Sam approached me, funny enough, via LinkedIn because at that time I was a big user of LinkedIn. Well, I still am, but not as much. Um, And he told me, I remember at Christmas time, he approached me, so, "Oh, Mark, we'd like to do a podcast together." And I thought, "Oh, God, I have to think about this." I don't normally think about things. I was just straight away, but without even thinking about it, "Yeah, I'll do it." But I thought, "Oh, I'm just going to think about this." And the reason I had to think about it is because I've got a bit of a fear factor with talking on a podcast. Video like this, not so much, but on a podcast with just my voice alone, stripped bare, really fills me with dread, I have to be honest. Um, so, but anyhow, that sort of egged me on in some ways. I thought, "Do you know what? Let's try and overcome this fear, or certainly practice it, so you get better at it." So we ended up doing this podcast together, um, and yeah, it's basically we reached not as many episodes as you. How many episodes are you at?
This will be 260 something
Well
something.
done, well done.
Two
We're
two
based
sixty three four
Yeah,
something like that.
we're about 100. We just done our 100th show.
That's
But,
amazing. Yeah.
but it's a short show. If we got a guest on, it's 25 minutes. If it's just Sam and I talking, it's 15 minutes. So it's nice. It's nice condense. My background, being the age I am, I was brought up in the punk era, and punk, I still love that aesthetic about doing it quick and proud and getting out there as soon as getting out of it as soon as you can. Keep it quick. So that's what I like doing. We got a short podcast for. Oh, I have to say this is very nice having the time to just talk and have a chat with you. Having an hour and a half. I'm quite jealous.
Well, I mean, the thing, different. There are different formats for different reasons. When it comes to podcasts, and I think it's great because sometimes sometimes you can really get into it, and it takes an hour or two. And sometimes you just want to have a quick hit. I've had comments in the past where people have said like, "Oh, well, I can't listen to your show." It's like I just can't listen to something for an hour and a half or 2 hours. I need like quick videos, 5-minute videos. And that's cool. That's totally cool. From my perspective, that's, I just want to have an in-depth conversation. And that's the fun part.
Oh, that's good for you. No, I think it's great. And it's good. There's good variety.
Absolutely.
So when the show started, Sam he does websites for photographers. He had a very clear aim about the audience and what he wanted from the show. With me, I just did it, as I said, to overcome the fear factor, and also because I wanted to give something back to photography without being a bit of a cliche about it. I really, at that time, I was just in doing branding photography. I knew I wasn't trying to sell myself to photographers, so I just did it for the fun of it. It's only recently in the last year or 6 months even that I'm doing more education that I can see now, "Oh, okay, hold on, I've got a platform here where I can actually maybe turn it into a financial an income. I might be able to get some people who might sign up to my masterclasses from it." So it's sort of changed a bit because of that. But, yeah, it's a commercial photography podcast.
So do you podcast every week or
Oh,
every
yes.
fortnight? How did you?
It's a weekly, yeah, we managed it with Sam cracking the whip on me. We've been keeping it together for a year. Yeah, it was a weekly episode for over 2 years now, sorry, not yet. A weekly episode for 2 years. So, yeah, we're still going and still going strong. We still got plans to change it, maybe do a bit more YouTube like you're doing or possibly I'd like to do a bit more YouTube because I could like earlier we were talking about photographers, it would be an opportunity to bring up pictures of photographers or like talking about lighting sometimes. I talk about lighting on the show and how to do I've come up with these 10 rules of lighting, as it were, and, it's very hard to talk about that on a podcast without having any visual reference, as we saw. That would make it a bit easier.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think to me, when I first started the podcast, or when Nick and I just first started the podcast, to us, it was like, well, it's a podcast about a visual medium, so it makes sense to have a visual platform for it. So it was never really a question as to whether we do YouTube or not. It was just like, that was going to be the visual
Yeah.
version of it. Because as you say, when you have a guest on the show and you talk about their photography, you sort of need somewhere to show that photography, or it would be nice if they're talking about a particular shot that
Yes.
you can actually pull
Exactly.
that shot off. And I tell you, who inspired me to that from the very beginning was Steve Brazel with the Behind the Shot podcast. I don't know if you've heard of
I
that.
know I don't know the name, but I know the title of the podcast, so I know exactly who you're talking
Yeah.
about there, yes.
So
Yeah.
Behind the Shot is a really great show. It's basically what Steve does is he always says he doesn't interview the photographer, he interviews the photograph. Um, because he basically picks one shot, and then I mean, I say the whole episode, but the basic framing of that episode revolves around that one photograph. So, he talks about how that photograph came into existence. He might dive into the technical aspects of how it was made, blah blah blah. What the thinking behind it was, all that kind of stuff. But as he does that, he peels back like an onion the different layers of what makes that photographer tick. And so, in a
Yeah,
sense,
nice.
he and I we often in a sense of kind of similar conversations. It's just he approaches it in a different way for me, and this is the beauty of it. And I remember listening to his podcast for years and years and years before I even started this. Um, and so, I always from the beginning I thought like, well, it makes perfect sense to have like a video option somehow. Um, yeah, I think
Yeah, no,
it makes
I
sense.
like it. Can I just throw something in there? Just when you were talking, my mind was just going off somewhere. I was gonna talk about we're both musicians. We both obviously have very we put a lot I spend a lot of time on our music. And
Hey.
I know you're a guitar player. I've seen a picture of you with your Les Paul, a very beautiful Les Paul you've got. I
Oh
saw a
yeah,
picture. I'm a bass player, and, you had a music school. I used to teach in the Bass Institute in London, so and
oh
I was a
okay,
session bass player. I played on lots of people's records and all that kind of thing. So and I still play music. I've got my own band, and I play in a wedding band. Anyhow, my point I'm making here is the comparison between how we study music and how we study photography. And it's a little bit about what I was going on about before, about the history. Uh, and the way we learn learn music. As a musician, we know you could talk about the Beatles or, whatever, and people will talk about a song and they'll say, "Oh, it's influenced by this." And we all know we're all connected on a common page, aren't we? Because musicians tend to know the history of music quite well, don't they? And again, it's quite a short period. Modern pop music's only in the last 70, 80 years. But nevertheless, there's a lot of it. So musicians talk about songs and so on and so forth. They also I'm sure hope you agree. We talk about scales and chords, and the stuff that's a bit boring to learn, but is uber useful. We don't get that in photography so much, do we? We don't talk photographers. When you get I mean, photographers in a room, they don't talk about photography. They talk about business or the lack of it, don't they?
yeah. Do you think that has changed over the last couple of decades? Um, Do you think that could possibly be because photography wasn't as readily accessible as it is today? I'm thinking it's really not that long ago that in order for you to actually create your own photograph, you had to, buy a roll of film. You were limited in the amount of pictures that you could take. You then had to take that go to some lab, even if it was just boots, for example, have that role developed. That would take time, and then you would come back with, a pack of I don't know, 36 images if you're lucky. Half of them are probably unusable anyhow.
Oh, more.
More,
More than that.
yeah.
Yeah, way more. Yeah.
And at the same time, of course, your only way of actually accessing photography was, there was no internet. Like, you could, there were books, exhibitions, but it was more
Uh,
difficult.
I disagree. I think it's easier to see good photography in the days of the magazine as opposed to the days of the Instagram. Let's compare the two. With a magazine, like a Sunday Times supplement, which, in 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 England, we so proud of The Guardian and The Times, all these beautiful colour supplements that come out, or in America, The Post or Life magazine, and there were photo stories of maybe, at least 5 or 6 pages, maybe even more, beautiful photo stories. And there was one photograph would lead to another. You get double page, you get single page, and they told a story, and there was a progression there, and it was engaging. These days, when you compare it to Instagram, you see one photograph, and that's it. It's got no relation to the next photograph you're going to see. So there's a, it's hard. So you can get. What does that mean? Does it mean what does it mean? Maybe does it mean you can get away with less these days? I don't know. I don't know, but certainly, I think I would probably say we're not it's not as rich an area of looking at photographs on the internet as it would be to looking at it in a gallery or certainly in a magazine.
Oh, and I absolutely agree with you on that, actually. So the point I was trying to make is that, now that we're so flooded
Yeah, that's what
with photography, that's a lot more meaningless in my view. For exactly that reason. You can find yourself scrolling on Instagram forever and ever and ever, and you're not really taking anything in because nothing ever
exactly.
relates to anything else. Whilst when you're when you're in a scenario where it's curated, it's maybe a magazine.
Exactly.
I mean, National Geographic's a great. I mean,
Oh,
I used to be addicted to National Geographic
yeah.
when I was a kid.
As a
It
lot
was
of
just
people were. A lot of people
yeah,
were and are,
absolutely.
shall I say, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I used to um I used to love when I was a kid, I used to love National Geographic, Vanity Fair, and Vogue. Those are the 3
Lovely.
magazines.
Yeah, I know. Well, you got
Um,
3 good mags there, that's for sure.
yeah,
Vogue,
from
Italian Vogue is for fashion, is the best. Still
and
is.
I never read the articles. I only ever looked at the pictures. That's the thing. Um, Apart from a number of guitar magazines that came into that as well. But,
Yeah, look, okay, we can go guitar.
but again, I mainly looked at the pictures of guitars, or guitar players.
Or a
It was,
transcription maybe in a guitar magazine of a famous
oh,
solo
yeah.
you want to learn or something. But
See,
yeah, good photography is really curated, and you have to pay into it to appreciate it or to see it. You won't see a body of work by Gregory Crucian, for example. You won't see that on the internet. You'll see maybe 1 or 2 images, of his more famous ones. If you wanna go and see his body of work, like Twilight, for example, the great book that came out in the '90s, you have to go to the gallery, and you see it in the gallery space, and when you go and you see it, they're like 6-foot prints, and it looks amazing, and it's an experience, and that is then owned by the artist and owned by the agent or the gallery, and they've got, or the book. You have to invest in it, and by investing in it, by making the effort to buy it or to go and see it at the gallery, I think you're more connected to it.
oh, absolutely. I tell you what, I had exactly that experience. Like I mentioned, only a week ago, I went to the National Gallery. Um,
Yes.
and the National Gallery is interesting for anybody who has the opportunity to visit London. I highly recommend it. In fact, there's two galleries there's multiple galleries that I would highly recommend. But there's
Ugh.
two in particular: it's the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery, both fantastic
Yes.
galleries.
Yeah,
But the way the National
and others as
Galleries, yeah, there's many more. London's a big place, but
well.
um, the way the National Gallery is set up is actually really interesting because one half is pre 1400 and the other half is post 1400. And so my daughter and I, we started in the pre 1400 section. It's basically half the gallery, and it's, I would say, 99.9% religious
Yeah,
paintings,
of course.
and they date back to, I don't know. I mean, some of them are nearly 1,000 years old.
Oh,
Unbelievable.
yeah. Yeah,
What
yeah.
struck me was obviously it was curated very well, but what really struck me was when you stand in front of some of those paintings, it's how detailed they were, or how detailed they are. For a painting that's 800, 900, 1,000 years old, I would have never imagined to see that kind of detail in, in a work of art from that time. It's also really interesting to see the development really through the centuries as to how things developed, how techniques changed, how media changed. Obviously, um, and but that was the thing. That's an experience you can really only get when you're in front of the actual thing, in a gallery, um, rather than a book. You just can't. I've never had that experience just by looking at an image in a book. It's when you're actually in the gallery and you see this thing in front of you.
Definitely,
It's
definitely.
just unbelievable.
And may I say, for the photographers that are listening, we're not just being arty pseudos here. This
Maybe a little bit, but yeah.
well, this will lead you photographers to better clients and more regular clients because this is what I was saying in my talk. I'm talking about the idea of ideas. Cultural awareness is going to give you ideas. It all goes in. And even though, it might be a 12th century portrait that is going in, and when someone sits, at some time you might use that idea to create an image for somebody, or it's going to leave you into something else. So it's important to invest time and effort in being culturally aware.
Exactly. The next time you have to pose 12 individuals, just think of, The Last Supper, and there you have
There you go.
it.
Okay. That's a great example.
You
That's a
know?
great practical example. Yeah, yeah. Okay, for headshots, it's, you're doing a corporate headshots all day, like you said earlier, 100. Okay, it's a little bit different. That's, you've got a formula there, you've got a light that's gonna work. But certainly from, for lots of people, I'm gonna make people look easy to use. But certainly for me as a branding photographer, and that's what I love about branding photography, it's all about coming up with good ideas, and it's a platform for me to
Yeah.
come up with those ideas.
And the just on an ideas level, so it's actually a really good comparison, doing volume headshots compared to, let's say, individual portraits.
Ugh, ugh.
It is all down to the ideas because the overriding idea when you're doing a volume headshot session is, well, simply down to the fact that you haven't got time to change your lighting setup. The underlying idea is, okay, how can you light a face? How can you light loads of faces that are different in shape, size,
Mm.
character,
Yep,
and make them all look good?
exactly.
How are you going to do that? That's difficult. That's not an
Well,
easy thing to do.
you end up using soft lighting, don't you? That, like I said, the clamshell lighting,
Absolutely, yeah,
because people can move around and the lighting, like at the moment, you can see on me, it's a flat lighting, and I can move around and it stays the same. Whereas on you, you've got a bit more shadowing on the sides, a little bit more, lighter in the front. It's a bit more directional lighting. So, for example, when I was shooting fashion, it was all hard lighting because the model would
yeah.
stay and you just light it and they'd be able to keep that pose and, I'll go back to it and they could repeat it. And you could do that with hard lighting. You can't do that when you're working with corporate clients so much or even
Yeah.
branding clients because they're moving around and then, you can't expect them to hold a pose. They'll just look really
Well,
uncomfortable.
that's actually that is super interesting. So I just spoke to Mark Vieira, who used to work with George Orwell back in the back in the days
Okay.
the golden age of Hollywood,
Mhm.
where of course everything was hard lighting,
Yes, that's
back in
correct.
those days, and it was just really interesting. That was a very interesting conversation, just talking about how things were lit, how George Orwell used to light things, and the techniques that he used, and it was a it's a really super interesting process, that's inspired me, for example, to use some of those or to bring some of those techniques, or at least to learn more about some of those
That,
techniques,
yes. Yeah.
you know, um, and what that does is it will eventually filter into, my work. And I think this is why, we come back to education, 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 where it's so important to educate yourself, when it comes to your photography.
I I really think so, and again, that's why I get annoyed by people saying it's all about marketing for making a photography. It's not. The marketing is important, but it's not all about the marketing. But don't feel guilty about going out there, spending time perfecting your craft and coming in. it should be part of your practice, part of your day. I know, get up early in
Absolutely.
the morning, do your social media posts, emails, answer all that. But allow time to go and take some photographs, try different lighting or editing a different style. Allow time for that. It's equally as important as going out there and
Absolutely.
marketing.
Best
Yeah.
piece of advice I've ever been given was by Joel Grimes, who basically
Oh, yes.
said to me, um, he said, "You know, I've been in this business for, what do you say, 40 years or something. I still do a test shoot every week, you
Oh,
know?"
wow.
And you
Yeah.
kind of go, "Well, what, I mean, what, you know?" He gets like, "I'll still practice every week." I'm like, "What do you do?" He gets like, "Oh, I'll do test shoots, you know, every week.
Yeah.
I try different things, you know, it's fun. And also, you know, then you go like, well, now that I know that, it's probably not that surprising to realize how good he has become.
Yes. It's of
If
course.
and
It's
that's also,
practicing
you
and
know, it's
trying new things out and making mistakes and and learning from mistakes.
yeah.
If I may throw another name out there, and you know Scott Chatino from the Tin House Studio, he
Oh,
does a
yes.
podcast.
Yes.
Yes. I'm a big fan of it. I love watching his podcast. He's British and he's got that great dry sense of humour that we've got. And we like
Yeah.
and yeah, I saw his latest podcast he did a couple last week, and he was saying, "Oh, how do you become a successful photographer?" And he summed it up beautifully with two things. He said, "A, that you're different, your work is different to everybody else's, because that's how you're going to get booked if you see the world in a different way, and but secondly, you're not an arse. That you're good with, you are nice to work with." He said, "If you
Absolutely.
do those two things, you do it well." And I thought, do you know what? That is so brilliant. It's nothing about marketing. Oh god, I'm on that rant again now, sorry,
Yeah.
but see the world in a different way. And it's so much when I had my fashion students, my at the degree students, it was we had about 60 students a year, and every year there'd be about 2 or 3 who would see the world in a really unique way. They weren't good technically or anything like that, but they saw the world in a really unique way, and lo and behold, guess which ones became successful photographers?
This is a creative medium at the end of the day, and, you know, creativity literally means coming up with ideas. So,
Mm.
you know, that's the thing to focus on. That note, Marcus, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for being the guest on the Chemistry podcast this week.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. That was we went everywhere. They did with music, everything, ideas. We covered a lot, mate. There's nothing, no stone unturned on that
No
podcast.
stone unturned. That might very well become the title of this episode. Okay, folks, that is it for today. What an inspiring conversation with Marcus Ahmad. So many valuable insights into the art and the business of branding photography and how podcasting can also amplify your creative journey. So remember, keep listening, keep learning. As always, before we go, let me just recommend another episode that I think you'll enjoy. Check out episode 253, where I explore fine art photography with none other than Anya Anti. I'm sure you love it. If you enjoy our content, consider supporting us on buymeacoffee.com/camerashake to help us continue creating and bringing you more exciting episodes. And again, I just really don't know why I keep saying we. It's actually just really me. Probably because the teleprompter says we. It really does mean the world to me. And for those of you listening to the audio version of this podcast, did you know that there's a fully fledged video version over on YouTube with plenty of examples of our guest photography in glorious Technicolor? Well, you should by now because I keep mentioning it all the time. All you have to do is head over to YouTube, search for Camera Shake Podcast, and you'll be able to watch all past episodes right there. If you're already on YouTube, of course, drop us a comment, hit the like button, ring the bell, and share with your friends. Your engagement helps us reach a wider audience all over the world. So thank you for listening and watching. And remember, a new episode drops every Thursday. So make sure you mark that in your calendars, diaries, whatever the heck you kids use out there, your phones, whatever. Until next time, keep shaking things up in the world of photography. See you next Thursday.